this is an information session about the Quantitative Developer Certificate that is run jointly by Talesians and WBS World Business Strategies. And if you are returning to us, having worked on other qualifications that are run by WBS and or Talesians, then you may have heard of the Machine Learning Institute Certificate, MLI. Now, MLI looks at the mathematics of machine learning. MLI looks at how neural networks work. It looks at how clustering methods work. It looks at how supervised, unsupervised, and reinforcement learning methods operate. Whereas mathematics is hugely important in, especially in finance, in quantitative finance careers, in trading careers, in quantitative development careers. Wherever you are in your finance career, it will be important for you to also know how to program. And I'm going to quote the late Mark Joshi and say that all forms of quants spend a large amount, that is more than half their time, programming. However, implementing new models can be interesting in itself. Here is another quote: quant traders must be familiar with data mining, research, analysis, and automated trading systems. They are often involved in high-frequency trading or algorithmic trading. A good understanding of at least one programming language is a must, and the more programs, in fact, the more programming languages the candidate knows, the better. C++, Java, Python, and Perl are a few commonly used programming languages. Familiarity with tools like MATLAB and spreadsheets and concepts like big data and data structuring is a plus. Here is another quote. I'm going to be giving you quite a lot of quotes from authorities on quantitative finance and finance in general and trading. In my opinion, and others will disagree, I'm sure, to be a world-class quant, you need to have in-depth knowledge of a low-level programming language, for example, C++, working knowledge in a few high-level languages, R and Python, for example, and strong working knowledge of SQL and databases. If we look at which programming languages and which programming technologies are the most popular, not just in finance, but in the wider world out there across all industries, then a very useful, I do apologize, then a very useful thing to look at will be the survey, which has been conducted by Stack Overflow. This survey says the second most popular technology out there is HTML and CSS, followed by SQL, followed by Python, followed by Java, by Bash Shell and PowerShell, C#, PHP, TypeScript, C++, C, Go, Kotlin, Ruby, Assembly, VBA, Swift, R, Rust, Objective-C, Dart, Scala, Perl, Haskell, and then finally Julia. However, if you look at finance specifically, you will see a slightly different distribution of these languages, of these technologies, because there are specific elements to this industry, which mean that different technologies and different programming languages have different relative weights compared to others. So here is another interesting piece by Sarah Butcher. We looked at the CVs of 6,025 professionals working at 16 top hedge funds globally. Not all were working purely systematic strategies. Some were multi-strategy funds. As the chart below shows, and we'll see this chart in a minute, one language in particular features on the resumes of employees at top hedge funds: structured query language, or SQL. There is a reason for this. Hedge funds which rely upon coding are all about devising strategies after collecting and analyzing huge data sets, and SQL is used within other programs to modify and query databases. Ranking behind SQL are C++, Java, and Python. They weren't nearly as popular in our example and C++ was ahead of both Java and Python. Now, many of you who know SQL will know that SQL is not really a programming language. It's a language for querying databases. You can call it a programming language, but it's quite distinct from many other programming languages in that it's a domain-specific language, SQL, right? It's quite different from Python, from C++, and the rest. However, things may be changing, though. To continue with the quote, Joel Sichel, a systematic trading headhunter at GQR Global Markets in New York, says that there's been a recent surge in demand for people who can code Python. Due to its transparency and ease of use for later users onto a pre-programmed system. This might be why Man Group's AHL coding competition, in which student coders compete for a £5,000 prize, is again being run entirely in Python. SQL doesn't even get a look in. So this is a chart from this presentation by Sarah Butcher, where we see SQL is hugely popular. Then it is followed, and again, as I said, the relative proportions attributed to these programming languages are different here than they are across all industries in their survey that we just looked at. So here we see SQL followed by C++, followed by Java, then followed by Python, C#, HTML, COBOL, and Hadoop. And of course, these the relative percentages given to different languages have certainly affected our thinking in designing the Quantitative Developer Certificate program. And indeed, you can see here that there is a certain strategy that we followed in order to give the candidates doing the certificate program the best possible, the most useful possible experience. Let's carry on. Python specifically. And Saeed, are you online? I think Saeed is with us as well. So Saeed, say a few words later on, especially if you have questions on Python.
Yeah, I'm online. Sorry, I just had to unmute myself.
So Saeed Aman, who is here, Saeed Aman is an expert in Python. He has authored several books, and he's an expert on dealing with alternative data, dealing with financial data specifically, from the standpoint of trading and the standpoint of risk management and the standpoint of general high finance. So he can tell you a lot about Python specifically. What I'm going to say here is that it's another quote from Sarah Butcher. If you wanted to prove your mettle as an entry-level banker or trader, it used to be the case that you had to know all about financial modeling in Excel. Not anymore. These days, it's all about Python, especially on the trading floor. Python already replaced Excel, said Matthew Hampson, Deputy Chief Digital Officer at Nomura, speaking at last Friday's Quant conference in London. You can already walk across the trading floor and see people writing Python code. It will be much more common in the next 3 to 4 years. As Python becomes more prolific, Hampson said banks are able to innovate more quickly. The industry's reputation for fastness is undeserved, Hampson said. The concept of rapid innovation has always been in financial services, but it was done using the Excel spreadsheet, and now we have a new vehicle for doing that, Python. I can run an Excel model with several hundred interlocking formulas and a data table that has 50,000 rows and 100 columns, and it takes 15 minutes to update, said one contributor to Wall Street Oasis last month. Or I can run a Python-based model with thousands of interlocking points and an underlying data structure that has 10 million rows and 1,000 data attributes, not to mention I can write scripts to infer missing data points. All of this can be done in about a second. That certainly kicks Excel out of the competition. Being able to work in Python is nowadays a must, not just in finance. In finance, it is becoming an absolute must, but it's also hugely important in data science across all industries in machine learning and artificial intelligence, especially given that most of the libraries that exist for doing machine learning and artificial intelligence are in fact written in Python. So Python, I think, is hugely, hugely important. There is no escaping learning Python at some point of your career. And here is another programming language that maybe fewer of you have seen, but here is another piece from eFinancial Careers by Sarah Butcher. If you want to be assured of a job in finance, it will benefit you to learn the coding languages K and Q. K and Q underpin the KDB Plus database system, which is used increasingly by banks, hedge funds, and high-frequency trading houses, and very few people are fully conversant in them. Given that recruiters say top contractors working in KDB Plus systems can earn 1,000, sometimes more than 1,000 pounds a day in London, this seems surprising. In any normal situation, supply might be expected to expand to meet demand, not here. A lot of KDB Plus jobs are project-based and very well paid, says Ollie Thompson, an electronic trading systems recruiter at GQR Global Markets. The reason for that is that there are simply not a lot of KDB Plus developers out there. A senior quant developer at a US bank who works in KDB Plus confirms that KDB engineers are hard. KDB Plus quants are even more rare. He says the reason for that is that KDB Plus and its associated languages aren't taught at universities. Quants are taught at schools, and since KDB Plus has a high license fee, most academics won't use it. It's only once the quant gets to their job that they realize the need to learn the language. And if banks want a skilled KDB Plus quant, they have to grab one who's been trained elsewhere. So KDB, why is KDB so important? It's the language of choice, and it's not normally used on its own. It's used in combination with, for example, C++, but it's a language of choice in high-frequency trading, and not just high-frequency trading, in medium-frequency trading, in electronic market making. Numerous firms such as Citadel, such as, for example, Deutsche Bank, numerous firms use KDB in those teams that work on electronic trading, on market making, and it's hugely important. And sometimes even teams in derivatives pricing use KDB as well. Why is KDB so important? Is because it's extremely fast. So we can see here that it has set records in real-world financial data analytics benchmarks called Stack M3. They were performed by Stack Securities Trading Analysis Center on behalf of Google Cloud Platform, GCP, and Intel. The Stack M3 benchmark was originally developed in 2010 by several of the world's largest banks and trading firms. It is designed to measure exactly how much innovations improve the performance of tech analytics. Stack M3 was developed favorite day hardware running the tests because it set performance standards that other providers couldn't beat. This fall, GCP became the first cloud provider to enter the Stack M3 arena, pitting the performance of market data analytics run in the cloud against on-premises results. These tests were particularly significant for KX customers who are focused on performance and the impact on latency in the cloud. GCP was able to demonstrate with these tests that for many applications, performance was almost as good or better than in bare metal. Also, because GCP working with Intel chose to run two separate benchmarks using KDB Plus, one for in-memory RDB and one for disk-stored HDBs, they highlighted KDB Plus's unique ability to perform high-speed analytics on very large datasets with real-time streaming and historical data all in one platform. So here's our strategy, how you can do exceedingly well in your finance career. Instead of learning SQL, learn KDB, or in addition to learning SQL, learn KDB. KDB comes with its own QSQL, and you will immediately stand out from all the CVs that people see. The knowledge of KDB, the experience in KDB will set you apart from the competition. So looking further at the benchmarks that were released by KDB, the GCP High Memory Instance RDB benchmark was run using KDB Plus 3.5. The objective was to see how the StackM3 Shasta test suite performed against the single large memory instance of GCP. This test uses standard finance market data queries based on the data being in memory. GCP used an Intel Xeon processor E7-8880 version 4, which outperformed in 8 of 15 previous bare metal tests using an Intel Broadwell EX. The GCP distributed HDB benchmark was also run using KDB Plus 3.5. The objective here was to see how StackM3 Kaniga test suite performed in the typical cloud distributed mode. This test checks the performance of standard finance queries, but in this case was executed across 5 years worth of market quote trade data in a 56 terabyte database. Although there were no world records, the results were solid and showed that even when using standard storage from GCP, the results are in the correct range, 1.6 times to 12.6 times compared to the performance of an on-premises distributed solution. StackM3 scripts do not lock in or shard data distribution, so it uses standard KDB plus speech MapReduce in the scripts with a single namespace for the HDB. This gives a sense of what performance you can get from shared persistent disks, shared read-only, for example, peak read rates of 12.7 gigabytes per second across the cluster of 13 nodes, which is extremely impressive, and these results are very difficult to get with any other technology other than KDB+. This brings me on to the next language that I think quants absolutely have to learn, and it's C++. Here is another quote. As HFT expert Matt Davey, Chief Technology Officer at Lab 49, a financial services industry consulting firm, explained in an interview, from an HFT platform perspective, HFT, of course, standing for high frequency trading, from an HFT platform perspective, C++ is the language of choice due to the latency requirements, he said. The lower the latency, the more C++ is important. C++ is used not only in low latency trading systems, and C++ is used in derivatives pricing systems. And you will see if you join any of the quant teams on Wall Street or in the city, you will see that that C++ is the language of choice for working with derivatives and for writing high frequency trading code. So C++ interoperates extremely well with Python. You will say, looking at the graph here, and I'll go back to this graph, say, okay, but what about Java? Doesn't Java lead C++ across technologies in the outside finance, not just in finance, or across all fields, not just finance? We will say that C++ does lead Java in finance when it comes to finance, but equally, once you've learned C++, it becomes significantly easier for you to learn Java. So once you've learned C++, Java and in fact C# become way easier to learn. And it's not as easy to learn C++ if you know Java. It's harder to make this transition. And in fact, once you've learned C++, once you've looked at Java and C#, you will in fact have all three languages in your tool belt, which I think is an excellent thing to have. So going back to what I said, I think some people will say, but C++ is 40 years old. Since it has been developed and designed by Björn Strustrup, who works incidentally for Morgan Stanley nowadays. C++ is indeed a very old programming language by modern standards, especially compared to Python. However, C++ went through several revisions, and I do apologize, I'm quoting myself here, my article in eFinancial Careers. C++ went through several revisions, namely C++ 03, C++ 11, C++ 14, C++ 17, and more recently, C++ 20. although not all compilers yet support C++20, the C++20 standard. Among the recent C++ features are the move semantics, unified initialization, lambda functions, multi-threading in the memory model, regular expressions, standardized smart pointers, hash tables, std array, reader-writer locks, fold expressions, structured binding declarations, parallel algorithms, and many more features that C++ programmers will find very exciting. Post C++11 is very much a different language, sometimes referred to as modern as opposed to classical C++. Here are the references that I mentioned in this very brief presentation, just to give you a flavor of the things that you will learn doing QDC. And here are some more references. So if you guys are interested, have a look at those references. But in the meantime, do you have any questions? Is it possible to get the slides? Sure, I think it should be possible. So we will distribute the slides. That was a question from Daniel Jones. Would like to be able to read the link slides. So yes, you should be able to. Any other questions? Now is a good opportunity for you guys to ask questions about the course, about the logistics, about anything that you would like to, or you can argue with me. For example, you can say that maybe our view of technology isn't necessarily right. So that would be an interesting thing as well. So I'm looking for your questions, suggestions, arguments, anything that you would like to add. Thank you very much for your questions, Daniel, by the way. Saeed, as an expert in some of these technologies, would you like to add something to what I've been saying?
Yeah, sure. I very much agree with you that having a knowledge of other programming languages is actually very useful. So obviously, like I spend a lot of my time programming in Python, so I find that extremely useful. But at the same time, I can recognize the benefits of understanding something like C++, and also say KDB, Java. I did done a lot of Java in the past as well. And what you tend to find is if you end up knowing multiple programming languages, one tends to reinforce the other. So as Paul was saying, if you know C++ and potentially Java is something that you can pick up relatively easily. And I would say that's an important part of programming, not mainly just to focus on one specific language and just learn that forever. Obviously, to begin with, you want to learn a specific programming language, but I think trying to have a look at multiple programming languages is extremely beneficial. And as Paul says, they have different use cases. That's the important point as well. So if you're dealing with high frequency tick data, pretty much all the banks across the street will end up having KDB as a way that they store their tick data, they query it, and they do their calculations on. So it's a worthwhile language to learn. So even myself, I've started to learn KDB to try and better get to grips with it. And obviously, Paul's the expert. He co-wrote a book on KDB, and he's used it a lot in the past few years. So he's definitely the person to learn from for KDB. And just speak, what you can do is you can write lower level libraries or C++ and then actually call it from Python as well. So you can end up mixing the languages in the same project, and that's something that happens actually quite often. You end up having some solution where you have to have the code executing really fast. That's written in C++, but then you write a wrapper on top of it in Python to make it more accessible to Python users. So often it's not the case that you use either or when it comes to programming languages. Often you'll end up using several. So I wrote a Python package. It's actually on GitHub for transaction cost analysis. There I ended up doing a lot of Python code, but at the same time I also did some code in Q as well. So I wanted to link up the two. So to be able to query tick data in a KDB database versus doing some additional computations in Python. So I ended up using obviously Python was the main part of that project, but I ended up doing a bit of Q as well, and that's one of the reasons I've been learning Q to try and help there essentially. So I guess there's also a question about KDB Plus performing in the era of GPU and GPU databases. I'm not an expert on GPU databases. So I have used KDB a bit, but I've not actually used any GPU databases. But I think from what I understand, and Paul can correct me if I'm wrong about this, that still in terms of Wall Street, KDB is still kind of the gold standard essentially. And one thing that I would say with KDB is, well, it doesn't need any specific GPU hardware as well. So even running on hardware which is not very expensive, you can actually see it runs very quick. I don't know if you've got any comments about that, Paul, about the question on KDB and GPU-based databases.
Yes, so that's, I think, is a very good question. So what I'll say on this is that we work very closely with KX, the company that makes KDB, and the guys at KX, guys and girls at KX who develop KDB, they certainly are aware of all the developments that take place, and certainly they are aware of the developments of the GPU front. In fact, in the latest editions of KDB, they have been heavily using things like Optane memory, which is available in some of the latest Xeon processors. So if you have Optane memory, you can designate memory, how it's specifically used in order to further optimize the performance of the program. KDB is parallel. So in particular, there is a Peach construction. There is .q.fc as well. There are ways of parallelizing your query, and there is parallelism under the hood. And you can also learn how to parallelize your code. And I believe that in more recent versions of KDB, we will see the use of GPUs as well. I mean, I think that the one thing that I can say is whatever is possible to squeeze performance out of your time series data, the guys at KX are certainly doing. Saeed, over to you. Do you have something to add to that?
I think that's definitely something that you can take away from the fact that it does support newer hardware. I think one key point to understand is that ultimately, to take advantage of any of these solutions, you need to be able to code. So in particular, KDB, the logic basically that you use for KDB is very different from many other programming languages. So when you're talking about the relative speed of each of these languages, ultimately you need to be able to code to harness that ultimately.
And I'll show that if you want to learn more about KDB, I have co-authored a book on KDB with Jan Novotny, Aris Galiotis, and Fred Deleze. So this is the book that we use in the course, and I will recommend it for you guys if you want to learn KDB in more detail. So it's quite a heavy book, and much of the content has found its way into the course. I'll probably there is a question by Daniel Jones, and thank you very much, Krishna, for the question that on KDB. I think I'll look at the question of Daniel as well. The question is, have we been contacted by recruiters for people from the program? Yes, we have very close links with many recruiters, and we have no issue recommending you guys to the recruiters as well. And there is a lot of interest from recruiters in people who have graduated from the QDC program. And we will be very happy to make the introductions as well, provided that you pass the exams and do well. So we are not ashamed of this introduction, and indeed that we hope that you guys will do very well in the exams, and it will be an honor for us to introduce you to some of the best recruiters in the city and on Wall Street.
And I was going to say, as Paul mentioned, I think the contracting rates for KDB are extremely high. So it's definitely a skill worth knowing purely from that perspective as well.
I'll say that for C++ as well, it's usually upwards of £800 a month, a day. Sorry, a month, a day, and you can make it even higher if you have perhaps niche skill set. So maybe, I don't know, I've been showing off this book here. Saeed probably has another book or books that he can actually show you as well. For example, on alternative data. So if you have this kind of skill set where you know, for example, KDB, and you know how to deal with alternative data, then you become even more valuable for recruiters. So there you go. So that's Saeed's book, just out, which has just come out, but I think I'll let Saeed speak about it. And in the meantime, I see there is another question from Daniel. I'm in the US. Do participants have to attend the live lectures, or can participants watch the videos at another time? So you can do both. You can either attend the lecture. I mean, I would recommend to attend the live lecture, because you can then ask questions, you can interact with the lecturer as the lecture is being delivered. But if for some reason you cannot attend the lecture in live mode, you can view the recording. So hopefully that answers your question. Do you have anything to add, Saeed?
Yeah, I would definitely recommend, if possible, to attend the lecture for the reason that you mentioned, because of the questions. I think that the videos will be available afterwards for participants. But I think in general it's probably advisable to attend the lectures if you can do. At least my experience from teaching on the QDC is that people do ask questions, so you get that extra benefit. I think there is also a possibility of asking questions after class as well. That's also a possibility at the same time. But it's kind of nice to have that interactivity, I guess, during the class. But we understand in terms of times. There's one thing I would say is that typically we schedule them in the evening London time. So it's not going to be the case that they'd end up being when you're asleep in the US. So that's probably one advantage as well.
That's a good point raised by Saeed. There are forums as well that back your studies. So once you have signed up for the QDC program, you gain access to the QDC forums, and you can ask questions there, and you can also contribute questions. You can see what other people are asking. So once you've joined the program, you have access to the forums as well, which is a useful part of the program, and we monitor those forums, and we answer questions that show up in the forums. So you guys have asked questions, so I can see that there are okay, there is another question. What are the prerequisites for the course? By Krishna Kishore. What are the prerequisites for the course? Said, maybe you can say what are the prerequisites for your part of the course, because we try to keep the course self-contained. We try to make it as self-contained as possible.
At least, I guess, just talking about the Python for Finance course, I essentially start from the beginning. So obviously, it's if you kind of understand programming to begin with, that's great. But the idea is that we start from the beginning. What's a variable? Talk about the various constructions like Python list and so on. I'd say even if you know other programming languages, there will be subtleties which are different between, say, Python and C++ and so on. Precisely what the definition of an integer is, for example. So even if you're aware of other programming languages and you've done them before, it's still actually quite good to go over the basics. But obviously after that, then we get up to speed very quickly. We go over Python specifics, things like pandas for doing time series, NumPy for working with matrices and basically n-dimensional arrays, and then all the different Python visualization libraries as well. A bit on scikit-learn, but it's not the main focus. And then the second half of the course is all basically putting into practice what we've learned on the first half from a financial markets perspective. So there I specifically talk about how you download market data from many data providers, whether it's Bloomberg or Quandl. Also how to plot the data, and also starting to look at how we develop trading strategies. And there I talk a bit about foreign exchange markets, because my background is in foreign exchange, and that's where I do a lot of my work over the past 15 years. So there it's basically applying whatever we've done in Python to kind of the more domain-specific aspect of financial markets and trading strategies. And later on, we'll play around with looking at tick data and things like that as well. And also very practical elements of Python, such as how do we link up Python with Excel? And that's really important, I would say, for any financial firm. People are not going to dump Excel at this stage. So Excel is always going to be with us, but it's nice to be able to mix Python with Excel, and also how to create web dashboards as well. So that again is a skill. So we try and have a lot of practical skills as well as part of the course. And a lot of it is based upon things that I've ended up doing for clients that I've done in the past in banks as well. So we try to make it practical, essentially, the course. That's not just my Python part of the course, but also things like KDB and C++ as well.
There is a question. The lectures take 10 to 12 hours per week. That's actually not true. The lectures take about 2-3 hours per week. Right? Say, how long are your lectures?
I think it's from memory it is around 2 hours. I think 2 to 3 hours. I think essentially, but it's it's not going to be 10 to 12 hours. Definitely not per. I would say is, and this is just in line with the question, I would definitely do self-study after that as well. So to get the most benefit from the lectures, to go over what we've done, maybe to start coding yourself as well. So that's really, I think that's really something that I would recommend doing. So it's important to do that and not just to look at the lectures in isolation. It's just like doing maths as well. The same with programming as well, that you need to also practice at the same time as well. So the lecture will give you insights and ideas on what to look at, and then you can also do a bit of self-study with that. At least with the Python course, I've got like various tutorials, and the idea is obviously not to give you the answers at the beginning, but later on to give you an opportunity to try your luck with understanding them.
So 10 to 12 hours with self-study sounds about right per week.
I think with self-study, that would be actually a decent amount of time. You could probably do slightly less, but I think the majority, one thing that I would say is that the majority of the time will be spent on self-study as opposed to just the lectures. That's the key thing that I would say.
So there is another question. How does QDC from Suraya? So Sarai Mohammed is asking, how does QDC compare to ARPM? Well, ARPM is a risk bootcamp, right? So it's quite different from what we're doing. So ARPM is looking at specifically risk, and it's focusing on risk. It doesn't focus on implementation that much. It's really asking, okay, how can I work with risk models? How can I work with VAR and so on and so forth? So the focus is very much on specifically risk. Whereas, yeah, sorry.
Yeah, just following on from, I would definitely agree with that. That the content is going to be different, and it's not, yeah, it's not so much about implementation. It's more about understanding things like VAR and so on. A lot of what we discuss, and talking specifically about my bit of the course, is that how you develop trading strategies. So that's very different, I think, from what's on that course as well. So, and in particular, something like KDB and C++, that's very much about implementation as well. So it's just a different target audience.
So just to summarize, these are two very different courses, right? Are there any other questions? I mean, I can see that quite a few of you have been quiet. So Howard, Kumar, Maria, Michelle, Natal, I think quite a few of you haven't been. Valentina, Yanis, I think this is a good opportunity for you to ask your questions. And I would certainly make use of this opportunity. So do you guys have any questions that you would like to ask? And thank you, by the way, Soraya, for your question. So this is a good opportunity to ask what questions you may have.
I think we must have already answered the questions, Paul.
We must have answered everything.
I assume
must have answered everything, yes.
So it's obviously a good presentation.
So hopefully, I think I also wanted to mention that there is a module specifically on electronic trading. And the kind of development that you do in electronic trading, including low latency development, is very different from the kind of development you do anywhere else. So the development of trading strategies is a rare skill for people to have and to learn. And this is one of the very, very few programs that I know of. In fact, it's probably the only program that I know of that teaches this specific way of programming. And it's very difficult to gain this kind of experience anywhere else. Maybe there are questions on that. Maybe now that I've raised this point about electronic and low latency trading, maybe people will raise some questions on this.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. That's very much a practical focused area. And it's not the type of thing that I think typically people know unless they've very specifically worked or managed electronic trading desks.
Does anybody want to add anything to that? Said, are there any other points that you would like to mention? Anything that we haven't mentioned as yet?
Yeah, like in terms of some of the stuff that I'll be teaching, it's basically trying to focus towards the practical element. So basically things that I would have done in the past or am doing at the moment for clients. So it's very much focused on the practical aspects of developing solutions for financial markets. So that's the key point that I would try and espouse, I guess.
Any other questions? Any other points that people would like to raise, to ask? We're very grateful to all of you who have asked questions and who have kept this discussion so lively. But now, if there are no other questions, oh, there is a question from Michelle. can each module be taken separately? This is probably a question for Ed. I don't think there is a provision for taking individual modules. And there is another question from Alberta. So maybe, say, do you know, is it possible to take individual modules? As far as I know, it's not.
I don't think so. I guess the main idea of the course is to try and take more than one module, so you get more of a rounded education in it. But I guess I think Ed also put something on the chat here, but there might be a possibility, but I would recommend, if possible, to try and do all of them, because I guess that's the whole point. You get a rounded education in many different areas, as opposed to just one specific area. I think that's the way that I would see it.
So there is a plethora of new questions now, which is good. And okay, if you really want to take an individual module, right? First of all, you'll not get a certificate in this case. You will not get the QDC certificate. But if you really, for some reason, want to take an individual module, email us, right? And perhaps there is something that we'll be able to do, right? If that is something that you really want to do. So send us an email and we'll look into this. That's to address this specific question. Then there is a question by Alberta. Is this course recommended also for people that do not have work experience? I think it's a great course for people that do not have work experience, because it's an excellent shortcut. Because the kind of skills that you learn in the course are very difficult to come by unless you have actually worked in finance. So you gain an advantage over people who have already worked. You take a shortcut, and you, having worked with us and having learned from people like Saeed, like Ivan, you gain experience automatically that will help you get your next job, right? Even if you don't have work experience in finance or in technology. Then there is a question from Krishna. Is this mainly centered around techniques used in financial markets, or Python, KDB plus, C++? The so mathematical will direct you to MLI mathematics. Financial markets, we have lots of examples, lots of applied examples in the course, and Python, KDB, and C++, so both. There is a question from Howard. So we have a test after each module and a final exam. So the answer to that question is yes, that's precisely what you get. You have a test after each module, and you have a final exam. So hopefully that answers your questions. Are there any more questions? Okay, so it is possible to do an individual module on request, right? But in order to get the certificate, the QDC certificate, you need to do all modules. Are there any other questions? Right, so then we have, okay, here is a question from Howard. After getting the QDC certificate, can we work independently as a quant developer? You should be able to, yes. You can contract, and if you are interested in opportunities, again, we can introduce you to some good headhunters. Provided that you do well in the exams, we can introduce you, and then they should be able to help you find consulting opportunities. Exams could be done online. Yes, the exams are actually done online. What if you failed the exam? Then you will have to retake it. So you should be able to resit the exam. But ultimately, you need to pass the exam to gain the certificate. Does that answer your questions? So we only have one chance for the exam, or we can retake it for free. Ed, do you know what the policy is for retakes? Do we charge people for retakes? I'm not sure, to be honest. I'm not sure, to be honest. Anything to add to this?
I would just say thanks for your time and all your questions. It's I think it will be a great opportunity to be able to learn stuff on this course, and I really hope that me, Paul, and Ivan will teach a lot of you that have joined on the course. So I really hope that will be the case.
There is a final question, I think, that should I be able to do the course completely online? Yes, that's the idea. You should be able to do the course completely online. Howard, with regards to resets, I hope that you won't fail the exam. So I think the right attitude is actually to go in with the intention of passing the exam rather than resitting it. So resits are not very common, but if you do fail the exam, you should be given an opportunity to resit it. And I would like to say, let us hope that you actually do pass it the first time round. As we have, okay, excellent. As we have no further questions, I suggest that we consider this question information session closed, and I would like to thank everyone for taking part in it. I would like to first of all thank all of you for coming, for asking questions, interest, and I would like to wish you a lot of success in your studies in QDC. I'd like to see many of you as my students going forward, and I would be looking forward to welcoming you as my students. And I would also like to thank Saeed for answering the questions, for being here. And I think it's an excellent opportunity for you to learn from Saeed. And I think that he will also be delighted to have you as his students. So thank you ever so much for coming, and look forward to seeing you on QDC. And I would like to wish you a lot of good luck in your careers in finance and technology.
See you everyone.
See you, everyone.